Today we'll be hearing from our fearless leader, Sean Sawyer, the Washburn and Susan Oberwager president of the Olana Partnership. Sean, amongst his as a nonprofit leader, has also been an architectural historian. So he's our buildings guy on staff who's going to tell us a little bit about how the thematic main house took shape in collaboration. In his journey to the leadership of Olana, where he started in 2015, he's also been executive director of the Royal Oak Foundation, another kind of partnership, the American entity that supports the National Trust of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So was executive director of the Wyckoff Farmhouse Museum in Brooklyn, and he is involved in many other organizations throughout our field around the country. Board of directors of the American Friends of Addingham, a really important entity for those of us who care about country houses and the decorative arts. He's also on the Arts, Architecture, and Design Advisory Panel of the New York State Council on the Arts. And he is on the Historic House Committee of the American Association of Local History. So deeply involved in our wider field. We're lucky to have him at Olana sharing his perspective on this special place. And we look forward to hearing more today as in his partners in design, Frederic Church, Calvert Vaux, and the making of Olana's main house. So if you will turn on your camera and join us, there we are. Welcome, Sean.
Hi, thank you, Will, very much. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you. Thank you, Will, for that introduction. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to speak today on a topic of particular interest to me. 2022 will mark the 150th anniversary of Frederic and Isabel Church moving into the main house at Olana, and we are planning a special exhibition to mark this sesquicentennial. And today's talk is really an opportunity to present what is a very preliminary examination of the collaboration between Frederic Church and Calvert Vaux in the design of the house. Remarkably, the meeting of these two great design minds in 19th century America is a subject that really hasn't been published in any detail. And due to this lack of information, you'll often see or hear the relationship at Olana between Church and Vaux described as one simply of patron and architect. However, as is everything at Olana, nothing is that simple in this relationship. And indeed, Church had the determining eye in every aspect of this 250-acre holistic work of environmental landscape art. But yet, I think today I want to put forward a few thoughts about what I think are really the very important, substantial contributions, the critical elements of the design that Calvert Vaux provided in this collaboration, ones that really address the functional needs of the family, of the architectural function of the house, and translated his friends' architectural inclinations and impulses really into a sort of masterwork of environmental design of 19th century America. The bulk of the talk will be a deep dive into the surviving architectural drawings in our collection, and I apologize in advance for the image quality today. I was really working from cell phone photos back when I put this together, but I think you'll be able to make it out. And I also want to acknowledge my debt that I rely heavily on in terms of Calvert Vaux and his career, and on Frank Kowski's wonderful monograph, Country, Park, and City, The Architecture and Life of Calvert Vaux, which I highly recommend for you to pick up in a used book venue of your choice. And I also want to thank the Olana Partnership's archivist and librarian, Ida Breyer, for her omniscient support in all things, as always. So let me start. I'll share my screen here. So here they are, the two gentlemen we're examining, basically contemporaries, as you can see by their dates. And I want to assume, first of all, that most of you will know the outlines of Church's biography and of his remarkably successful career as a landscape painter. And there really isn't any time to survey this in any way today. I just put up here the sort of great work of Heart of the Andes, and suffice it to say that really this incredibly ambitious painting was the pinnacle of his fame as the United States' first international art superstar, completed in 1859. And it really was the must-see phenomenon of its day in the art world. It toured 6 US cities, as well as going to London. The public reaction and the critical reaction was ecstatically favorable, I should say. The most memorable quote to my mind is Mark Twain's that I've reproduced here, one that is just speaking of the kind of gasping pain of taking in everything that Church has managed to represent here in this Humboldtian vision of the Andes. The painting was purchased by William Blodgett, the collector, for $10,000, which at that time was the largest sum ever paid for a painting. And Church was, by this time then, an international celebrity and a very wealthy man. However, I'm sure that Church himself would agree that the greatest treasure that came to him through Heart of the Andes was that of the love of his life. For at one of the viewings in his studio in New York City, he met the raven-haired beauty, Isabel Mortimer Carnes, seen here in a wonderful photograph in our collection. And, lest we think that celebrity culture is a new thing, you can see here that their courtship was covered by the broadsheets. This quote from the Boston Evening Transcript, January of 1860. And indeed, as was a kind of coy announcement, public announcement of their engagement, and they were married on June 14th of 1860. And they really appear to have had an uncommonly happy, close marriage that lasted until their deaths a year apart, Isabel in May of 1899, and Frederick in April of 1900. And it is remarkable and very significant for understanding Church's worldview that this world-famous, wealthy, global traveler of an artist decided to settle with his new wife and begin their family not in New York City or a suburban location quite near the city, but back up the Hudson River here at the seat of his artistic consciousness. And I show you here this remarkable sketch in our collection from May of 1845. And in 1845, 19-year-old Frederic Church, studying with Thomas Cole in Catskill, he's trekking these very hills, the ridge known as the Siegenberg or Long Hill, and sketched this view, and I hope you can see it well enough. It's a faint pencil sketch done on site here from the top of Red Hill, looking to the across from the east to the west to the Catskills and the Hudson River. And it's at that time was a part of the Winson Breezy Farm, and it would be 15 years later, in May of 1860, a month before his marriage, at age 34, that he purchased this farm, this 126-acre farm. And here is the view, this exact view seen today, remarkably the same, including some of the farm buildings in the foreground. Having purchased the Breezy Farm, Church established a farm manager in the existing small farmhouse, none other than Theodore Cole, Thomas Cole's eldest son, and set about having a new house built for him and Isabel. This was Church's first design partnership at what would become Olana. And who his partner was is not exactly clear. At the top left, you see an unidentified perspective sketch of the house that's in our collection. And lore has it that, that the architect working with Church was Richard Morris Hunt, his future fellow resident at the 10th Street studio. They were not yet, he was not yet there together with them. But another person that Church was in contact with by this time was Calvert Vaux from at least 1859, the year before, when Vaux joined the Century Association in New York City. And several years before this, in 1853, you can see Vaux designed a small home and studio for Church's good friend Jervis McEntee, the painter, in Kingston. And certainly the similarities of style and the sort of picturesque cottage ornate kind of style, very, very close to that of Cozy Cottage. And in any case, Isabel and Frederick moved into Cozy Cottage, as they called their new home, in the early summer of 1861. Their first child, Herbert Edwin, was born here the next year. Their second child, Emma Frances, in 1864. And they lived here for the next decade, referring to the property as the farm. By 1867, Church had constructed a farm complex that included 10 distinct buildings, including barns, wagon house, an ice house, an 1.5-acre kitchen garden, which you see a view of here, located just to the south of the wagon house, as well as extensive orchards providing a diverse selection of fruit and vegetables for the family's use, as well as for market. But from the beginning, Church had ambitions beyond agriculture for the landscape here. You can see the view from the high point of Church's farm, a painting he commissioned from Arthur Parton, a local topographical painter. This shows the highly worked landscape, the remnants of logging in the foreground, plowed fields stretching down the hill, and the largely deforested landscape in front, grazing pastures rolling down to the Hudson. Now, 1864, the year of this painting, is also the year that the seminal text of American environmentalism was published. George Perkins Marsh's Man and Nature. I'll show you the cover of it here, a copy of which is in Church's library. And Marsh's writing had its root in his travels as the US minister to the Ottoman Empire, where he understood that the barren landscapes that he was seeing were the result of deforestation caused by intensive agriculture. And he urged Americans in his book to heed this lesson, to avoid desertification, as he called it, of their lands by restoring the natural balance through reforestation. And that this is exactly what Church did during the first decade of his ownership at the Breezy Farm, the farm, planting thousands and thousands of trees, as he said, all native species, and gradually restricting the acreage under cultivation to the lower, more fertile portions of the property. And here you see pretty much that same view today as the designed landscape that Church created, as well as the quote about his tree planting, his reforestation project. So let's just quickly return to the family life, which is what the house is really all about, or not all about, but it has a key component of it. And in March of 1865, Isabel and Frederick are living here in Cozy Cottage with their 2-year-old Herbert and their 6-month-old Emma. They go on a visit to New York City, and both children that month contract diphtheria and die within 10 days of each other. And the parents obviously are very devastated. This is not such an uncommon loss at that time in history, but nevertheless, a very, very tragic occurrence in their young married life. Isabel, however, is already 3 months pregnant and gives birth to a son, Frederick Joseph, that's September 30th, actually. Today is September 30th. Happy birthday, Frederick Joseph. Eventually, they will have 3 more children, and it is clear that the family, you see the other children here in a sort of compilation representing about 1875, when the main house has been completed. It's clear that the family is growing beyond the bounds of Cozy Cottage, and along with their travels and their collections of art and artifacts gathered as they move around the world, there's also the social pressure to entertain and live in a style appropriate to Church's standing as the country's most celebrated artist. And I would suggest perhaps there's also an element of competition. For in 1866, Church's principal rival, Albert Bierstadt, moved into his brand new mansion above the Hudson at Irvington, known as Malkiston. And this sort of confection of balconies and mansards was designed by Jacob Ray Mould, the English designer, who was a close partner with Vaux in work on the Museum of Natural History and the Metropolitan Museum in New York, most notably. So in any case, whatever the at the top of his farm and begin planning a brand new house. The first mention of Church's intention to build a house appeared in the New York Observer on August 15th of 1867. And on the basis of the drawings in the collection here at Olana, it appears that at this time he commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, again, someone he would be familiar with from New York City, to produce a design. This design that you see here, this sort of French Alpine design, with the Catskills looking more like the Alps or even the Dolomites in the background, seemingly inspired by, I would think, maybe Hunt's most recent trek through that area of the world. What it does do, though, and the one sort of element of this design that carries forward is the establishment of the main entry facade on the east elevation of the house, away from the Hudson and the Catskill Mountains. So in other words, from this moment on, it's clear that you're going to approach the house from the east with the view as a backdrop and with the view from the inside of the mountains and the river as a sort of destination within the house. The plan, again, which here, I apologize for the quality of these, but just quickly to show you, has a central sort of axis that runs through the entry through to this library with its great buttressed forms, almost church-like here on the west front facing the river. However, in this plan, there is really no attempt to address the southwestern view that is even grander here at Olana, or any sign of really those essential elements of any country house, the indoor-outdoor spaces, porches, verandas, and balconies. So there it lies. In the autumn of 1867, Isabel and Frederick, accompanied by 2-year-old Frederick Joseph and Isabel's mother, Emma Carnes, sail from New York for Europe. The first stop was Paris, where at the Universal Exposition that was ending, Church received a silver medal for Niagara. However, their main destination on this journey was the Eastern Mediterranean, or the Holy Land, then Greater Syria politically. And it's important to note that the Paris Exposition of 1867 featured for the first time in a Western sort of World's Fair context exhibits of Middle Eastern and Islamic architecture. Here you're seeing these engraved views of the pavilions that were commissioned by the Ottoman Empire, but designed by the French-trained architect Léon Parvallier. And so this is something that has gained some notice in sort of the way in which Western eyes are looking at this Eastern subject matter. So something that's very important, clearly, going forward here in our thinking about the architecture at Olana. By January of 1868, the churches had arrived in Beirut, which became really their principal base, along with some stays in Damascus and Jerusalem. And here you see Frederick and Frederick Joseph posing for a tourist photo on a camelback in Beirut. And aside for the new energy that the trip provided for Church's painting, it was really a the most important catalyst for his and Isabel's thinking about the new home they would build on their return. And you see here this quote to his good friend Erastus Dow Palmer up in Albany, the sculptor, "I have got new and excellent ideas about house building since I came abroad." Church's correspondence during his trip with his close friends, Palmer and his friend and patron William Henry Osborne, make it clear that he had come to see himself as an authority in architectural matters. He even urged Osborne in one letter to wait for his return to proceed with his own building projects, saying, "I will gladly proffer my services if you have confidence in a man who has just completed his architectural education at the Parthenon." Specifically, it seems that the church's Middle Eastern travels really inspired some key elements in their thinking about the new home they would build. Hunt's early design that we've seen, but it was refined by their experience of these grand homes of Beirut and Damascus, such as that represented here in this quick sketch of churches in Beirut. And these houses were enlivened richly with pattern and color on the exterior and the interior. And then the interior space, that it could be focused around a great central court with these richly decorated interiors opening off of it, that would be reminiscent of the experiences they were having, again, in visiting some of these great homes in these cities in Greater Syria. And here you see, again, another quote from Church to Palmer. So on returning in 1869, Church was extraordinarily eager. They returned in June of 1869 from their travels. He was extremely eager to start on the new house. It appears that he contacted Hunt once again and communicated his enthusiasm for the architecture of the Middle East. And the result, I believe, seems to be this design, which is in the AIA collection in Washington, in Hunt's papers there. It's primarily distinguished here by the kind of extravagant use of stone and brick, which fits with the church's observations in the Mideast. The stone and the brick patterning creates this kind of richly polychromatic decorative effect that really picks out the planes and the volumes of the house. It's interesting to note that one element of this design that Church might have had in his mind was the use of brick, in particular, above a stone-faced ground floor. And that sort of movement, very traditional in Western and in Renaissance architecture, from a sort of rougher stone to smoother surfaces above, the kind of gradual refinement of surface as you move up the volume of the building. And indeed, in August of 1869, he had written to Palmer saying that, quote, "Great conclusion arrived at building is this: thick walls the first beauty. There can be no perfect building without thick walls." Wonderful quote, capturing something of his tone. And indeed, when you're at Olana, you can observe how immensely thick the stone walls are here. Hunt's design that you see here is very similar to a large Newport house that he was then in the process of designing for Mrs. William Coles, albeit in wood, so sort of stick style, as Hitchcock would have said. But in any case, we don't have evidence or correspondence between Church and Hunt, but Church was apparently not satisfied because there's no more record of Hunt's involvement. And by May of 1870, at the very latest, Calvert Vaux was clearly Church's new collaborator. Now, as I've shown, by this time, Church and Vaux had known each other, and they traveled in the same artistic and social circles in Manhattan for over a decade. And so certainly their social connections and shared enterprises would have ensured that they each entered into this relationship, with their eyes fairly wide open. However, in Vaux, Church did find, I think, the perfect collaborator. The Englishman's design practice, design pedigree was really tailor-made to address Church's preoccupations in creating his new home within the landscape setting at Olana. Vaux was steeped in the theory and practice of picturesque design, first in his training in England with Louis Cottingham, and then in his partnership here in the United States with Andrew Jackson Downing, based in Newburgh, New York. And it was through this association with Downing that Vaux catapulted to the fore of country house design in the US following Downing's tragic drowning in the Hudson in 1852. In this practice of building country houses up and down the Hudson Valley, he demonstrated, I think, what I believe are the sort of three fundamental competencies that would have strongly recommended him to Church. First, for Church, the landscape artist, I believe, would have embraced Vaux's landscape-driven design approach, in which the siting of the house is the primary consideration, how to capture views, make the house an element of the view, particularly from the river. And Church, I think, also would have appreciated Vaux's pragmatic approach to environmental concerns, really his integration of passive solar design, for instance, in the preference for placing primary living spaces on the south and east, and service functions on the north. Secondly, Church's newfound enthusiasm for Middle Eastern architecture would have found a very open mind in Vaux, as you can see here from this quote from his Villa and Cottages in 1857. He was really very notoriously liberal in his adaptation of historical styles and ran into some circles among the more staunch of the Gothic revivalists in New York at that time. And finally, I think, and unimportant, certainly last but not least, Church, ever the Yankee, would have been very pleased by Vaux's reputation for bringing projects in on time and on budget. I want to highlight two of Vaux's prior works that I think display characteristics that are part of what defined the main house at Olana. First, On the left, the N.P. Willis House in the Hudson Highlands at Cornwall and Hudson, seen here in a wonderful engraving and view from the river, the bottom left there. So this is an example of a house placed at a summit to be seen explicitly from the river, to be part of the view, as Frank Kowski says, an expressive alliance of house and place. And then on the right, there is the William Finley House in Newburgh of 1851 to 52. And this has a plan that I think is worth noting in the context of Olana, a sort of unusual cruciform plan here, these two axes intersecting in a central hallway, and all of the rooms communicating with this central hall via what are double sliding doors. And what this affords in terms of view lines, sight lines, for a house that's overlooking the river in particular, and also for airflow and circulation and healthiness. So I think these are two that in particular stand out to me as important. So now I'm going to really get into the heart of the matter here, the real deep dive, look at a lot of these drawings, mostly by Church. I want to take you through this selection. They're largely undated. I have attempted to place them in sequence, part of what architectural historians do, piecing together evidence. And Church had plunged into the planning house on his return from his travels, as I said, in the summer of 1869. And here you can see this quote, "I'm perfecting my house plans," Church to Palmer, September 22nd of 1869. So even before we know Vaux is involved, Church is himself drawing plans. This is the earliest by Church himself. It shows the main stairs and the service stairs paired here in the center of the house, a large gallery space with a fireplace on the north wall as well as windows, and a large dining room on the south west facing the primary view of the orientation of the house. The hall is small, but it's central, and it has a wide opening to the main stair, again, a characteristics that we'll find in the finished house, and views from the hall to the south and to the west. In this next plan by Church, the hall assumes it's a cruciform space, shape, and it opens, and it opens access to all the rooms that adjoin it. And there is a primary north-south access from the gallery through the hall to what is now clearly an indoor-outdoor space, a deeply recessed porch. A veranda is indicated in sketch form on the southwest corner here, outside of the dining room. But the main stair is this piddly little thing tucked over in a corner, a very unresolved sort of a treatment of it. And what I can say about the collaboration at this point, I'm now showing you a much more carefully drawn plan by Vaux or Vaux's office. It appears to me that Church would periodically go to Vaux in a sort of advisory architect or architect of record, we might say, role, and have a measured drawing like this, summarizing the development of his own thinking prepared, that's done in these more loosely drawn plans, but also helping him address any particular difficulties. And in this plan, Vaux builds on Church's prior work, resolving the stair issue by placing it in its own sort of large stair hall off here in the northeast corner. And the entry porch is significantly aggrandized with a portico and a sort of an entry space to the front door. And this is the first appearance of the term ombra here for the semi-enclosed porch between the two principal bays of the south facade. Important development. And the use of this term, which literally means, shadow or shade in Italian, to describe this sort of recessed porch appears in Vaux's work a decade before Olana, in this design for the Moses Shepherd Asylum in Towson, Maryland, where ombras appear on the residential floor, with a little blow up here, ombra. This is the floor of bedrooms for the patients at the asylum. And they are gathering spaces for the patients to receive fresh air and moderate sunshine, not direct sunshine, which in Shepherd's theory about mental health was absolutely essential to curing the patient. And indeed, this kind of gathering place for moderate sunshine and fresh air is exactly what the Ombra at Olana, here you see it as built in a family photo from the 1910s, would serve that same function. The second floor plan evolved at this time is quite interesting. And here you have a generous provision of 6 bedrooms, which is double the number that ultimately are built or created. And most notably, I think, they also correspond with a cruciform-shaped central hall, and in which there is a large octagonal seat under a dome, as the legend says. And I think it's very intriguing to consider the nature of hospitality at the church's house that would have encouraged such gatherings on the bedroom floor. In any case, fascinating, and not at all what was built. And then this next plan is quite interesting, in Church's own hand, with marginalia sketches and sections and details. It's showing him attempting to break open the closed volume of the stair hall by inserting a large window on the landing. Indeed, this is a feature that will remain in the built house. He also has reassigned room uses, introducing a breakfast room here on the west facade, but not showing either a gallery or a dining room labeled, and therefore perhaps leading to the conclusion that maybe he's seeing this large space with a fireplace as the dining room. And then sure enough, in this plan by Vaux from May 28th of 1870, the dining room and picture gallery are combined, but they now occupy that closed volume at the northeast, with the stairs shifted to that central space on the north-south axis with the Ombra here. This is essentially the plan of the main house, the original block of it as built, although the service wing is expanded significantly in construction. Here's the second floor plan from the same set of drawings, showing that the generous number of bedrooms is given away to more luxurious accommodation for the family itself, particularly what appear to be his and her dressing rooms. And then in the last plan by Vaux from June 23rd of 1870, the stair hall is shown more fully articulated with these sort of 3 steps that run up with a balustrade to a landing at the bottom, and then go up a run to a landing and turn and go up. And so you could, this is pretty much what the working drawings would be based on, that Vaux would then start to prepare. So now I want to switch to the exterior expression of the house, the elevations in the surviving drawings. And they evolve simultaneously with the plans, of course, and the majority of the surviving elevations are for the east entry facade, what we're looking at here and what we saw in that first drawing potentially by Hunt of the sort of Alpine design. And all of the surviving elevations are in Frederic Church's hands, all the elevation drawings, indicating that while Vaux consulted closely on plan development, it really seems that Church had complete control over its exterior expression. And here are 2 early sketches showing him experimenting with the massing. Both are somewhat ungainly, in my opinion, but there's a clear emphasis on the entry point, the central entry door, and the sort of circular window form that he seems fixated on above the window. And both also, very interestingly, have a projecting balcony on the southwestern facade, as it would become, which is over out of the principal bedchamber above. And they're remarkably similar to the sketch that he made that I showed you earlier of the house in Beirut with its projecting balcony there. And I think, suggests, not surprisingly, that Church's own travel sketchbooks are an important design source. And indeed, if you look through these drawings, and I'm only showing you a very small fraction of the surviving drawings, it appears that a number of the sketches, again, apologize for the quality of these, but a number of them are actually done on pages from his travel sketchbooks, such as the one on the left, for instance, here. And this sequence of sketches shows you Church making the decision to draw up the southeast corner here of the house into a tower form. And it's the sketch on the lower right, down here, that he then works up into a finished rendering. And this rendering really documents an important point in the design development. It has all of the essential massing of the main house as built, the tower at the southeast corner, entry as a sort of recession plane receded between the tower and the bulk of the gallery dining room facade on the northeast, and then the service wing projecting to the north and northeast. And it's also lacking but it is also lacking in much of the decorative treatments that he had experimented with in earlier sketches, and it appears quite restrained, really, relative to where he had gone in some of the design sketches leading up to this. I would suggest perhaps more castle than Persian villa in this instance. And I believe, it seems that it's at this juncture that Church calls on Vaux, and this is a really horrible reproduction of a somewhat, sketchy perspective by Vaux, but he calls on Vaux, I think, at this point to really bring his vision forward. Here's what I'm thinking. Where can I take this? Help me out here, friend. And in this relatively quick, sketchy perspective in Vaux's hand, it shows a much more sort of well-balanced and articulated treatment of the masses of the house and the openings. The bulk of the gallery dining room is drawn up, set back, and elevated, and it kind of serves as the high point in place of a tower on the southeast corner. So I think maybe Church's reaction to this was a little, unplussed. And so we next get what has been widely published, this sketch by Vaux, this perspective, much more fully sketched, even titled at the bottom with legend, as a study of a house for F.E. Church, Esquire, Hudson, New York. Just really fantastic, really fanciful, extravagant. And so Vaux has elaborated the design dramatically. This is dated May 28th of 1870. And here you can really see the distinction between the professional architect and the artist designer in the deft handling of the sort of massing and of the details of the building. The dining room gallery volume becomes almost like a reliquary there, and it gives sort of a grandeur to the entry front. The tower is on the southwest corner, the sort of facing the river and mountains corner, and it has this sort of stunning onion dome with, I don't know if you can see here, but a gallery, a viewing gallery that is colonnaded that you would walk around, supported on these brackets, projecting out over the Hudson. It's sort of a beacon to be seen from the major thoroughfare that the Hudson River was at that time. Another crucial feature of this rendering is the great sweep of the entry drive that you see here on the lower right, approaching the house on this elevated stone rampart-like foundation. And it also appears that Vaux even proposes that the drive approaching from the south should pierce under the house. If you can see that arch there, this idea of it wrapping up in a great spiral to the front door, intensifying the drama of the approach even more. Well, ultimately, as the ambitions of this designer tempered, probably largely by Church's budget, but he did embrace this concept of this southern approach to the house from below, albeit stopping short of tunneling under the house itself. Still, he committed very substantial resources to build the sweeping retaining wall for the last section of the approach drive in order to create this really dramatic effect of the house appearing into view in a very calculated way. So here, I will just quickly show you the last walk, which probably most of you are familiar. Coming around that curve, boom, the tower, through the sort of painterly trick of foreshortening, rises up above you, creates an even greater sense of grandeur. The front door, so obvious, the umbra so there as well. The two facades opening sort of origami-like to your view at once, a kind of architectural coup de grace. And this sort of careful calculation of aesthetic impact in the design of approach to the house brings to my mind sharply the diagonal approach to the Parthenon from the Propylaea, the entry gateway, that had only come into wider knowledge and appreciation in Church's lifetime with the demolition of the medieval structures that had grown up around the ruins here on the top of the Acropolis. So this view that Church painted in the Met, this fabulous painting of the Parthenon, is exactly from that angle of approach, the diagonal, where all of the sort of optical tricks of the Greek architect, which Church was very well informed of and very much in awe of, come into effect and work aesthetically to engage the viewer and perception, create a sense of grandeur and magnificence at Olana. Perhaps about the great painter, his family, not as much about the goddess Athena and the city of Athens. But nevertheless, this was an effect that was widely known and commented on. And indeed, in 1923, Le Corbusier, the great modernist, sort of celebrates this diagonal approach and this careful planning of it in his book, Vers une Architecture. I think it's also instructive to consider, perhaps even more suggestive, to consider this very intensely personal significance of the house's design by looking at one of his other great paintings that Church was working on during the period of construction, Syria by the Sea, at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And here, the sun, its intense light, which is the traditional symbol of Christian truth and salvation, bifurcates this landscape, and the viewer moves from right to left, past the ruins of pagan and Islamic antiquity, to proceed towards the light along a sweeping causeway leading to a Crusader castle overlooking the sea. Church himself referred to the house at Olana as a feudal castle. Is it a stretch to suggest that the Churches who had lost their first two children so tragically might have been contemplating their new home as a familial fortress of the Christian family? Well, whatever the personal motivations, Church's design approach was clearly elevated by his collaboration with Vaux, and as he moves forward with the design of the elevations, he sketches prolifically, trying many variants for the towers, the windows, the door surrounds. Here I just show you a few of these more well-executed drawings. He plunges into loose sketches that translate into the working drawings that Vaux's office is working on. Here's a detail of the southwest corner. It's all through this hot summer of 1870 that this is happening, that the drawings are being done in Vaux's office in New York City. Although there's a big delay because of the heat. In fact, on July 27th, Church writes very frustratingly to Palmer in Albany, "I have been much delayed by being separated from my architect, although he has been up several times to see me, and the late hot weather has chilled active effort." And then in parentheses, "That's the biggest bull ever uttered." Any case, excavation begins in August of 1870 on the foundations. The masons working are a local family, the Smiths from Catskill. And by the time that winter sets in and the work stops in November, the masonry of the walls is half completed. By the way, the lead mason is quite a hoot. His name was William Smith, and he was a larger-than-life personage who claimed to be the original Uncle Sam and dressed the part. Here you go, little character enrichment for the construction process. The two most fully rendered elevations that we have in Church's hand, which are widely reproduced and here at Olana as well in the gift shop, etc., capture the house really as pretty much as built and date from the spring of 1871, the second construction season. And by this time, construction has progressed to the second floor, and the house is becoming the subject, as you see here, quite a lot of comment from his artistic circles, whether it's Heed or McEntee. A particular notable quote comes from Church in a letter to the artist John Ferguson Weir, where you can see here he's expressing his frustrations with the workmen and the contractors, the same ones that anyone who has experiences in our world work. He writes to Osborne in July of 1871 that, quote, "When night comes, I have out my portfolio and drawing board, and I work late and hard and keep well." He says it further, "The house will be a curiosity in architecture, it will be convenient, and the picture from each window will be really marvelous." As construction progresses, he's literally keeping a day or two or a little bit ahead of the construction crew, finishing details. Here you see drawings of various levels of finish, the cornice designs around the dining room gallery block, the master bedroom window, of this fairly loose little quick sketch, but what becomes real in the brick and cornice work over the stair window on the north facade. And then these incredibly suggestive but unbuilt details, including this one showing Isabel, I would suggest, with the raven hair here, in profile on a second floor window. And I do want to stress at this point that there is evidence, particularly from Downey, their daughter, and her reminiscences later in life, that Isabel was a really crucial design partner as well at Olana, particularly in the sort of aesthetics of the house and the inspiration from their travels in Damascus and the Holy Land. So that is something that should be considered as we look at this as a project for exhibition. In the third season of construction, the roof is going up, and this is 1872. Here's designs for the tower brackets in little sketch forms, almost on note paper, and then much more finished watercolors of the slate tiling patterns, and including one that might incorporate Isabel's initials, her maiden name, C is Church and Carnes as well. Isabel Mortimer Church, 1872. And so it is in this year, 1872, that the house is complete enough, has a roof on it that they can move in. But the interiors, particularly the main floor, took another 4 years. And just quickly, and I know I'm pressed for time, so I'll just quickly run through what you all know of the interiors. And here you see, just to make the point of some of these effects, this is this photo showing the stair carpets in place, soon to be back in place in reproduction form in the next few weeks even. But you can see the sort of sense of this inspiration from their travels. The point was made by the French architectural historian Mercedes Vollet in an essay for the Detroit Institute of Arts exhibition catalog, that Church was particularly impressed by these again, courtyard houses in Damascus. Here you see this is a photograph actually in his collection, with the sort of Iwan opening here on the end of the courtyard with a raised dais, very much reminiscent of the Stair Hall configuration. And then this opening of all the spaces, and Isabel particularly writes in her diary about how these just magnificent sort of richness of these interiors, the ability to see from the central space into all the other spaces, was just so impressive to her, and these light and color effects that occur here in her own room, so to speak, the sitting room. That is probably the most richly sort of Islamifying space, with these cartouches with the pseudo-Arabic that run around every surface defining the wall planes. The painting of Petra integrated in its design with the colors of the room, or vice versa. And indeed, this painting, finished in 1874, does come to be the resident sort of character of this space. And throughout, these effects that they noted in their travels are incorporated, and as Mary Roberts pointed out in her webinar most recently, somewhat dimmed today, definitely, and I think you can see everywhere, if you look closely at Olana, little brasses that would have been brightly polished and gleam, the metallic paints that would have been, that have oxidized but would have been much more bright in tones of gold and silver. And all of these patterns come out of books that Church purchased and that are in his library, mostly French sort of studies of Islamic architecture. Interestingly, a little side note, he hired a number of skilled workmen for the interiors. In particular, one of note is the then 20-year-old Herbert Myron Lawrence from Albany, who went on to become the chief designer for McKinley & White and worked on projects such as the redecoration of the White House under McKinley. So interesting to think of that connection with his youthful work here at Olana. The stair is a huge feature of the interiors. This is Vaux's drawing, much more in a Gothic revival style than probably suited Church's taste, and also at a steeper pitch. So Church lavishes attention on just magnificent sort of variants of design for the stair. Ultimately, it's something much simpler, cheaper to produce, but very innovative in the way that it uses light effects to create movement and pattern. The brass, again, each one of these little clips, can you see here in the square frames, would have shown much more brightly back when it was completed. And then, let's see. Just again, more attention on the arcade. And this is the house pretty much as finally built. And then in 1888, Church decides to pack up the studio in New York City, really focus his painting studio efforts by adding a wing on the house here off the western facade. And so you're seeing the plan that's a modern plan with that added on. He served as his own architect in this. Vaux was not involved in this. And in adding the studio wing, he really pushes the house right to the edge of the cliff, creating a sort of tower-like structure with this impressive stone foundation that to me might recall that wonderful perspective of Vaux's in some at least sort of sense impression way. And here you see the house on a bright summer day with this sort of sublime cumulus cloud forming the perfect foil. And the architecture's effects really does change dramatically with the season and the weather. And indeed, this is something that Church noted himself in a letter to a visitor later in his life in 1896. He wrote, "I'm afraid that if you see my house on a dull, cloudy day, you will be inclined to criticize the predominance of details, the lack of repose that is the most important expression in architectural art. Fortunately, the soft golden atmosphere glorified everything the day you called. Even defects were lost in the general effect." And I think this, really is the fundamental concept behind the design of the house at Olana, and that is that it is but one actor in the drama of the picturesque composition of the entirety of the designed environment. It complements and is complemented by the landscape. It really is a proto-environmentalist design, environmental design, and this was an approach very clearly shared by both Church and Vaux. Here, for instance, note this wonderful quote from Vaux's book, Villages and Cottages. "Fields, mountains, and rivers will be more important than the houses that are built among them." And it's also fundamental to Church's identity as an artist, not only who painted landscapes, but really thought in landscapes. The house at Olana represents the sort of perfect union of architect and artist, of architecture and landscape. And at Olana, man finds his home in nature, and Adam and Eve return to Eden. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, for that rich talk. You've helped me to see the place afresh, as always happens when I get to attend one of your walking landscape of Olana, and I hope that others have enjoyed looking at this place through the eyes of a proper architectural
run long.
Thank you all for being with us. If you're not already a member, please consider joining at olana.org. Please do send in questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I see that we already have a few in a moment. A few reflections for myself first. Some things I was glad to hear. I'd never heard one of my secret personal favorites, Nathaniel Parker Willis, put in dialogue with Olana before, and that was great fun. That's somebody well worth Googling for all you out there. His Outdoors at Idlewild, this really charming book by a popular Republic of Letters in the 19th century, talking about country life. So great fun to think about lessons learned from that charismatic example. You helped me to see things that are strange about the house, the proximity of the northern service court to the northern studio window, the biggest single window of Olana, looking down on the hidden parts of the function of the house, the dirty business. Very strange there. You helped us to see the word gallery from the very beginning of the function of the house. For those of us who do think about it as not just a New York State Parks historic site, but also a museum, a very special museum. It's really interesting to see him thinking about that term from the start.
Yeah.
One question.
He had always planned on what he would do with the things he bought. I don't think he just bought things on spec.
Right. I wanted to ask you to do a little bit of speculation, the answer to this, but one thing your talk raises is the nature of this relationship between Vaux and Church, and what might seem to us who are outside that relationship as some presumption on the part of an amateur to edit the work of a pro. And I wonder how you think Vaux might have felt about that when...
I think that's where we need to bring somebody like Frank Kowski, who really knows that relationship, Vaux's relationships in his other practice, and particularly with Olmsted, right? And I mean, from my understanding of reading Frank's work and of David Schuyler, his work on Olmsted, this was sort of an attribute of Vaux. One reason why he was in a way successful was his very willingness to sublimate his own ego to the service of greater projects. I mean, whether that was being recruited by Downing, who was this kind of cult figure in the Hudson Valley, and is to come over, from England as a young man and, work with him. Obviously had a benefit when Downing dies suddenly and he takes over the practice essentially. But, I think in Central Park, it was, it seems to me from my reading and not from direct knowledge and research, but that Vaux was constantly trying to almost put Olmsted forward, and saying that, this is your role in life, man, come back from California and those silly, operational jobs you have out there and be a designer, and work with me on this, right? And I think, Vaux seems to really have been an architect's architect in the sense of the ability to handle functional issues, integration of site and building, and just, that, as I've already made the point, seems to fit very well with what Church needed. And he did, I think it seems to me, sort of from the evidence of the drawings that survive, sublimate himself to Church's vision.
Makes sense. And maybe we're getting a little insight into a different perspective of Morris Hunt. Maybe he wasn't as ready to step back and honor the client's wishes, however off the wall they might be. That's helpful. You raised the specter of Olmsted, and we have a question from our friend, Dr. Christine Oaklander here. Do you see any connections in the design process of Olana to the design process of Vaux and Olmsted at Central Park?
Lost you, Bill.
Oh, sorry,
lost you.
Lost you as well. Let's try that again. Dr. Christine Oaklander was asking, do you see any connection the design process of Vaux and Church at Olana and Vaux and Olmsted at Central Park?
Well, that's an excellent question. And this is a subject specialist deep dive into something very close. I can't pretend to be the one who knows that very well. And I think we should definitely be looking at that as we try to understand this and bring people into the exhibition process. Again, it's my somewhat really, educated layperson's understanding that, that it was somewhat similar in the sense of the sort of bigger vision of Olmsted and shaping the landscape, its relationship to the city, it's sort of the spokesperson for what it meant, with Vaux there working in the trenches, making sure it got done and the buildings fit in and worked and were functional. But again, we should bring in some other voices to offer more authoritative, knowledgeable views.
You gave us some great visual culture there for other artists' houses. That's a personal interest of mine. I'm pleased to see a question also from Christine about the history of Olana. We've seen that Bierstadt's Malkasten was already being celebrated in print, that very different model of an ideal artist country house. Could you help us understand the reception of Olana a little bit more? You gave us one great quote from that summer hours at Olana, these early accounts in the press of how received. Are there any other of those press, published, engraved accounts of Olana that we should be aware of?
Well, again, I think with the ones from correspondence that we have are what I was able to, with Ida's help, pull up and kind of, bring to bear in the moment. It's another topic that we should definitely look at as we develop this exhibition is, I think that quote is the one about the sort of way in which the seasonality and the light really affects the reception of the architecture is an extremely important one, because as Jenny Robb, I pulled it actually from Jenny Robb, from her most recent book, in terms of how it mirrors very exactly and strikingly the criticism of Church's own paintings later in his career. That they focus on detail. They lack a sense of kind of cohesiveness that that is what happens with the kind of Barbizon and Impressionist kind of view of landscape that's melded and fused by light and brought together. And he's a detail guy. I mean, look at those drawings of that stair. I mean, I showed you like maybe 6. There have to be 150 different designs for the stair rail. So he's so focused on these kind of decorative effects, but also understanding what he wants in terms of the spatial planning, because really I think the plans show that he's the one that sets the basic theory. But what conversation did he have with Vaux when he's starting out about Vaux's house that I showed down in Newburgh that had the double doors that opened up? We don't have those at Olana. We have wonderful broad arches with these beautifully decorated spandrels, but so it's a much even more open flow of space. But clearly Vaux was moving in that direction already himself. So I think, there's a richness of conversation that we'll never recover, and we just have to sit back and hypothesize about.
Yes, indeed. It's fun to speculate. That's the nice side of not having all the documentation we might like. Another thing that might be fun to speculate about on the subject of getting into the details, Mr. Church, we have a question from one of our valued volunteers, Donna Strites, asking, what do strange ceramic teapots on top of the bell tower? Are they a nod to British heritage, one of our associations with tea? Any thoughts on that? Your pet theories?
I think there's a lot more that we have to learn about the Far Eastern, East Asian kind of interest of church in the collections and in the amalgam of collections and decorative effects that create meaning in the house. And, one of our, big priorities is eventually to try to bring back the Neihanzu Japanese silk painting of the ascension of Buddha to Nirvana that really dominated the Stair Hall. And so if you think of that with the figure of Buddha, and I did show you a little sketch that exists in Church's hand that shows the Stair Hall with the Buddha sketched in early in the design of the stair, right? So he's not somebody who's decorating after. And as you pointed out, gallery is in there from the beginning. He's somebody who's thinking of the things that he has acquired as very meaningful and not just decorative, but saying something about the way in which he and his family live, the place they live. And I think, a number of people have been working and thinking about that at Olana. This exhibition is going to give us an opportunity to maybe just really pull something together that will kind of pull all these threads together in a more meaningful way. So the teapots, they're wonderful. Would anybody from a distance, unless you were a visitor and went up in the crow's nest, know what they were from below? Probably not. But Church did. And just like at the at the Parthenon, the back of the sculptures of the pediment at the Parthenon, you can see at the British Museum, were completely, fully rendered. They would never have been seen by anyone. But it was the importance of the sort of sacred nature of the work and its integrity of cohesion of form that was paramount for an artist.
Makes sense. Last question. In this body of visual culture you've shared with us today, it becomes glaringly obvious to us one of these ways in which Olana is. There are other artist houses out there in the world, but there seems to be this consensus in the period that the correct style for the practice of the creative country life is Carpenter Gothic. It's all Gothic all the time. Maybe some rare exceptions out there, but the houses of writers like James Fenimore Cooper, certainly that Bierstadt monstrosity.
Well, look around us. We got lots of wood.
Yeah, lots of wood. It makes a lot of sense. And then he goes.
Look at Dutch colonial architecture in the Northeast. Whatever little pocket region they were in, they adapted their vernacular architecture to the materials that were in hand. Where there was clay, like in the Upper Hudson Valley, they used brick, or New Jersey. But in central Ulster County, stone. In Long Island, the Dutch houses were all timber. But similar forms. So yeah, Carpenter Gothic is the cheaper, more affordable thing. That was fine for cozy cottage. Yep. I think when stone has to have a stone house.
It's really striking that frugal described to us went for something that was out of the norm for the time, that he went for the really costly.
Well, I believe Mark Przeworski would remind us that, he was noted as blasting when he did the roads and everything. So he had dynamite. So, he had stone in the ground, you could blast it out. And we believe, I think the records show that the bulk of the stone for the walls and foundations of the main house were right from the site, from the creation of the foundations.
All right, I think we'll end there. Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you all for being with us today. Please join us for our next subject specialist talk before long.
Thank you, everyone.